All right, it looks like it's at the top of the hour. So we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for who is joining us. We have a few announcements as everyone joins. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during this session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask you to keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. It looks like we're ready to get started. I'm going to hand it over to our speakers to begin. Kevin, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. This afternoon session continues what we started this morning. It's a really fascinating series of talks on coupled fire atmospheric modeling, the advances that we've seen in recent years, their applications and opportunities. And this afternoon, we've got an amazing array of speakers, starting with Russ Parsons, who's a research ecologist with the Missoula Fire Lab, U.S. Forest Service Missoula Fire Lab in Missoula, Montana. And Russ is going to be talking about re-envisioning firefighter training with 3D physics-based fire models. Russ, you can go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Well, before I get started here, I just want to acknowledge my many partners in this work. I'm very grateful to work with all of them. Over the last few years, we've seen the fire seasons just getting pretty crazy. Spurred by climate change-driven drought, declining forest health, and heavy fuel accumulations, our fire managers face a constantly changing landscape with increasing risk, complexity, and uncertainty. In many cases, the memory reel they have developed from past experience may not apply to these new conditions. How can we best prepare them to take on these new challenges as safely as possible? Firefighter training is intended to empower firefighters to recognize situations that can compromise their safety and to develop the tools for them to mitigate those threats. Yet, most firefighter training at present is out of date and slow to change. For example, the picture at left is part of current pre-course work for S490. This is the question that goes with it. Do you know the answer? Now I'm going to have to shout out to Llewellyn Hollingsworth on this one. This is the correct answer here. The bottom line here is that out-of-date training can endanger firefighters by leading to complacency. We understand that there are many factors that affect fire behavior that firefighters should pay attention to. Yet, having a static list of factors and really thinking about what they mean are different. Sometimes people develop a checklist mentality in which if firefighters simply kept track of all the things in a list, their safety would be assured. We know this is not the case. People have to engage with safety. At present, videos play a huge role in our firefighter training. Our brains are so geared to visual information that we naturally get a lot out of watching videos. Firefighter training videos often include both footage of the fire itself, as well as interviews with folks who were part of an event. Smartphones give us increasing access to new material, but it takes a lot of work to assemble that into coherent content. Video is very powerful, but it's also fundamentally limited to what you can directly film. In many cases, it's hard to really capture the underlying fire dynamics that are so important to firefighter learning from that single perspective. In many cases, our training materials are based in older technology. While it is good to be able to go old school when stuff doesn't work, new technology offers a lot of new possibilities. Sometimes it seems a tad funny to be using an overhead projector when elsewhere people are interacting in 3D over the cloud. One key idea in improving training is removing some of the abstraction and getting training closer to reality. Now, those of you that know me probably could say that I have not that great a grasp of reality to begin with. In the context of training, however, there's a new vocabulary you need to be aware of. Extended reality refers to an umbrella set of things that in which reality is modified. This includes both virtual reality that we're familiar with, which has the headsets, often handsets as well, and then augmented reality, for example, Pokemon Go, in which digital elements are added to a live view. Now, I've been chasing those things around. I still can't grab one. Now, another aspect that's really important to our new firefighter training is, of course, physics-based fire models, which is the topic of this session. So, although it's new to us in fire science, virtual reality is quite established and has been used in training in the military and industrial settings for well over a decade. It is particularly important in dynamic settings where many factors can affect outcomes, such as wildland fire. I've been lucky to work with Matt Gibson at the Northern Rockies Training Center. Matt is constantly testing new ways to train people better. Here, I'm going to walk you through a few things that he's been working on that just give you a sense of what is possible. First, you'll see him appear as a 3D avatar. He's going to wave. Or maybe he doesn't wave. Now you'll see that he's looking through a split screen, and he's using a VR. Those points that you see are where fire starts. This is using a 3D camera to take pictures of an area and then develop materials for hazard tree assessment training. So in this case, we have a tree that is got a seriously widowmaker break in the top near power lines. Here's Matt demonstrating that in an interactive 3D environment, he can manipulate objects, setting them up specifically for testing chainsaw training. So now you can see he's walking around the scene, giving the person the opportunity to experience this scene themselves. If they were in VR themselves, they could walk around and look around for themselves. As you know, trees falling on people is a pretty serious part of the risk that firefighters face these days. And learning how to set up your chainsaw and evaluating the dangers that you face are a critical part of firefighter safety. Here you can see in the VR, Matt is showing how you set up the sights on the chainsaw. Here he's illustrating also the use of basic game engine physics to give more realistic simulations of a tree falling. These are things we're working on as we build our capabilities in VR-based training. Here he's demonstrating a different approach that we're thinking about as a possibility for additional chainsaw training. And here you get to see the use of a 3D virtual environment for briefing on a unit. In this case, participants are interacting in this 3D space. They can talk to each other. Sound is spatial, so if you're closer to someone, they hear you better. In addition to being able to present the scene, you can also have materials like videos or maps up for them to see. You can interact and reinforce information in this environment. You can also produce realistic simulations of things that are in that scene. Oops. Trying to move on. Okay. Now, of course, this session is about physics-based fire models, and you're going to hear more about them. But the bottom idea is that these models give us an entirely different way of looking at what fire is doing, which gives us new capabilities in firefighter training. These physics-based fire models capture many aspects of fire that are difficult to describe, particularly with old school training approaches. One such aspect is the interaction between fire and the atmosphere. Here, you see these streamlines representing the acceleration of the wind in this middle of this topographic feature. But as the fire kicks in, you can see that buoyancy from the fire starts to dominate and overcome the ambient wind. We also see the formation of these common counter-rotating vortices that are part of the convective interaction between the fire and the atmosphere. Because these models track numerous quantities in 3D space and over time, they can be used to calculate more sophisticated metrics. This video shows overhead and oblique perspectives of the same fire simulation. The green cylinder is tracking thermal dosage, a measure of exposure derived from heat transfer calculations. We can see it changing over time as the fire gets closer to that location. Because this approach takes account of both radiative and convective heat, it is a more complex measure, providing a more sophisticated basis for safety zone calculations. One of the key benefits of using physics-based fire models and developing material for firefighter training is that, unlike old school video, which is typically limited to a single perspective, i.e. where it was filmed from, you have a great deal of flexibility in the perspectives, enabling you to view the same simulation from multiple viewpoints. Here's just a few examples of the same simulation shown from multiple viewpoints. You can also highlight different aspects of what is going on, taking advantage of the calculations that are done in the models. So simply making videos of simulations thus expands our ability to communicate about fire. This animation illustrates the use of a physics-based fire model, in this case, Loudermilk's WFDS, in a VR. What you'll see is that Trent Schweitzer, who's a master's student in computer science who put this together, is walking around the room, and the fire is burning in these small trees right in front of him. It's like it's right in the room with him. One of the challenges with using advanced fire models has been a lack of data availability. I'll be talking about this later in this session at 2:20 p.m. Eastern Time. But our team has been developing FastFuels, a 3D fuel modeling platform that leverages FIA and other spatial data to model fuels in 3D seamlessly over large areas, enabling 3D fire models and also facilitating powerful visualization. Moving out of that immediate close-in perspective from the earlier video, VR offers a way to really experience the landscape in the fire. This demo video, developed also by Trent Schweitzer, shows the fire simulation output from Loudermilk's WFDS model displayed first in smoke view and then through the gaming platform Unity. Smoke view enables easy visualization of a fire simulation. Here you can see the terrain, fire, forest fuels, and smoke. Smoke view can be used to visualize many other aspects of the simulation and is thus a critical tool for analysis of these outputs. You can see that once you're viewing this interactively with a VR, the experience for the user is very different. In this case, the trees that you're seeing came from our FastFuels platform. And the fire behavior you're seeing comes from the physics-based model. So what we've done is we've taken model output and we've translated it into the VR where the person can have a more first-person experience of it, both walking through the scene and also flying around it. You can see that we represent trees with relatively simple low polygon 3D objects, but you could use much more high polygon objects as well, providing almost photorealistic detail. However, there are trade-offs in the resolution that you want to represent these things, particularly with as you get more interactive and as the scene is bigger. VR and physics-based fire modeling open up new possibilities for training. We hope we can expand this effort. While this stuff may come across as just whiz-bang or trendy, for me it is more than that. I'm inspired by my colleague Matt Gibson's reflections. With 17 years experience as an interagency hotshot, Matt has seen a lot of fire. Back in 2004, while doing a burnout operation on the Willow Fire in Arizona, he came very close to accidentally killing one of his firefighter friends because despite his experience at that time, he didn't anticipate how fire lines would interact. His experience underlines how we need to enable firefighters to better understand how fires might burn so they get the time and space to keep themselves safe as they do their critical work. All right, I think that's it for me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Russ. Really appreciate it. Ryan, unless you see any Q&A, I don't see anything in Hoover, but Russ, we've talked about this for a while as really kind of a flight simulator for fire managers. I mean, finally, we don't throw we don't throw pilots into 747s before they have a chance to do things in a flight simulator. I'm really excited about this. How far off do you think we are in really getting a kind of a photorealistic and really tight user-controlled fire experience into the in a WCT training world?
Well, I think that we're building a capability here for managers to start to interact with these things quite soon. We need to expand our overall pipeline out of the prototype mode, but I think what we just showed here is what we call a playback mode, in which the physics-based fire simulation is simply displayed in space and time within the VR. That we're farther along with, but we have also developed some prototype work in which it's actually interactive, in which the fire model is called from within the VR. And so what that offers is a possibility for really truly interactive training in which the fire is responding to the person in the scene. This is really important for prescribed fire training, where ignition patterns and other local conditions make a huge impact on the outcomes. Yeah, so I'd say we're close. This is the kind of thing where I think we can see people really starting to use sooner than later.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan. Unless you see something that I don't, if any of the panelists have any questions for us, please chime in. If not, we'll maybe stop sharing and let Alex load her presentation and move to the next talk.
Actually, I have a question, if that's okay.
Please jump on in, Kara.
Russ, this is really cool, and it makes me think about expectations of those trainees as they move out of training in this VR space into expectations for how models will perform in real scenarios down the road. Do you have any thoughts there on, their access to physics-based models and training, and then maybe their lack of access to those same models once they get out on the line?
Well, I think that where we're headed, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in my later talk, but I think we're headed to a place where the data to run these models and the models themselves will be much more accessible than they've been in the past. But particularly in the context of training, if you can have managers take their prescribed burn or their fuel treatment and run it through a couple different scenarios in 3D and look at the outputs, the more detailed outputs that we get from these models, it gives them a much wider perspective on what the possibilities are than they would have if they just used our common point functional models. So it might be a longer time frame before we see them using these models in the field directly, but I think particularly in the course of training and in off-season planning and testing, I think these models are going to be available to them sooner than later. That's my hope.
Awesome. Thanks. Anyone else? If not, Alex, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen, even if we've got an extra question. Great. Well, if you, I do want to mention while we're getting Alex's presentation loaded up, because some of the Q&A can be a little clunky and we've got tight timelines, I do want to point out that tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we're going to be joining forces with Alex Dye's fire modeling and climate change session to have a fire circle where we can interact a little more in a little more relaxed pace and free-form discussion with the presenters and hopefully some managers really think through these the application space. So if you don't get your question answered or asked in this, please join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern time for that fire circle. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alex Jonko. She is a researcher at Los Alamos National Lab. She studies atmospheric science and fire interactions. And she's a fantastic climber out there. Alex is going to be presenting on capturing the sensitivity of fire spread to small perturbations in atmospheric conditions using computational fluid dynamics models of wildfire behavior. Alex, all you. I don't have audio on you right now, Alex.
Is this working?
Yep,
That's
that
better.
sounds great.
Okay. Let me go share the full screen again. Yeah, thank you, Kevin. As Kevin just mentioned, I'm at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I'd like to acknowledge that it is located on ancestral Pueblo land. I'll talk to you today about two studies that I've been involved in recently, which looked at the sensitivity of fire spread and fire behavior to small perturbations in atmospheric conditions. One of them I have led with Yedinak from the Forest Products Lab. And I also want to acknowledge all of these other collaborators and co-authors who have participated here in this session, as well as in this research. So the atmosphere has long been acknowledged to be a chaotic system, and that means that it shows strong sensitivity to small perturbations. And in particular, this is a well-known fact in weather forecasting, where ensemble simulations are used, which Kevin has already alluded to in his presentation as being important for capturing or bounding the uncertainty. And basically in meteorology and weather forecasting, what this means is that initial conditions are slightly perturbed many times, and simulations are run repeatedly to then obtain an average forecast, but also to get a sense for the uncertainty about that forecast. And I like this example from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts of their 50 ensemble members that they run for every forecast they generate. And here they're shown on globes as the temperature anomalies over Europe. And if you focus on one spot in Europe and sort of try to look across these different globes, you start seeing that there's really a lot of variability and a lot of differences in these temperatures. And so knowing that fire is really influenced by the atmosphere as one of its main drivers, the question arises whether we should be doing the same for wildfire prediction, for understanding prescribed burning in marginal conditions, maybe even more so, because there we're dealing with smaller overall wind speeds and less intense fire behavior, which is more susceptible to perturbations. And so Kara and I looked at this by running an ensemble of idealized fire tech simulations and looking at fire spread in homogeneous fuels and its sensitivity to atmospheric turbulence. So we're basically looking at a tall grass prairie ecosystem here, but highly idealized. Our fuels were homogeneous grass, and the wind field had a log profile with 2.5 meters per second at 10 meters. So near the surface, this was below 1 meter per second. So very low winds. We're really looking at very small perturbations in the turbulent atmospheric flow field. And so we spun up our atmospheric conditions in a large domain, which was 1200 by 1200 meters. And within that, we then nested 9 small subdomains, which you can see here separated by their white boundaries. These were all 400 by 400 meters large. And I'll just show you what the wind field was doing at 2 meters, the horizontal wind speed. So this is now all one simulation. These boundaries and the yellow ignition lines are just here to kind of guide you to understand how this then all plays out with the small fire simulations that we'll run later on. And so the wind speed, the average wind speed is the same across this domain. It's really about the tiny little wiggles that you see here. And so when we did ignite fires, we did this 5 times in a staggered manner. Oops, sorry. First, I'll tell you a little bit more about my turbulent flow field. So here we looked at the large domain and we basically put 49 virtual sensors across the domain to get an understanding for what wind speed at 10 meters per second, turbulence kinetic energy, and turbulence intensity at 10 meters were doing. And I do want to highlight that we have very low TKE in these simulations. It's about an order of magnitude less than what we would expect from some observations in grasslands, where it's closer to 1 meter squared per second squared, and we're between 0.1 and 0.15 on average. This is related to the fact that it's actually difficult to spin up turbulence when you have a homogeneous fuel and basically no surface roughness. So we're currently working on other approaches to generate more realistic turbulence. And we have a very talented graduate student, Jenna McDonald, continuing this work, looking more at chaos aspects of it. So stay tuned for exciting new results. But for now, just acknowledge that this turbulence was, if anything, on the very low end of things. So then let's take a look at the results that we got for burn scars for 45 ensemble members that we ran. And so across the top, you'll see the 9 domains. And then we ignited 5 different fires, which were separated within the turbulent flow field by 1 minute. We treat the spatial and temporal dimension here as interchangeable because our fuels were homogeneous. And so we're basically, for all of these simulations, just looking at a different instant within the turbulent flow field that the fire was ignited. And so you can see quite a bit of variability. There were a couple of fires, such as these guys up here, where the fire spread only from a small portion of the ignition line. There was some separation. There was a lot of different fingering happening. And then there were also fairly large burn scars where the fire spread in a more coherent manner. And so if we look at a couple different metrics for clustering and diverging behaviors of these different fires, you can see again that there's a lot of variability in our results. So we're looking at distance from the ignition line over time, from which you could calculate rate of spread. We're looking at area burned down here, and then fuel consumption over time as well. And if you look at this percentage-wise, we have about 400% variability when we look at, for example, area burned. So that's a lot. There's a lot of difference that is induced in these model simulations only due to the fact that we've slightly varied the time of ignition, basically, within a not very turbulent flow field. So we were interested in seeing how many ensembles you really need to run to sample this variability. And so we calculated the average area burned and standard deviation of area burned by including more and more ensemble members in our calculation. And you see that after about 20, there's not a lot of variability in both of these metrics. Especially we're interested in standard deviation, which is basically the range of outcomes. So this first ensemble was 45 members. We could have potentially gotten away with half that, but we didn't know before we ran this calculation, of course. The other thing that we were really interested in looking at more closely was the impact of initial conditions versus boundary conditions throughout the simulation. So the way that FireTech works is that if we have a wind field that we have spun up, we save the initial conditions at the time step when we initialize the simulation, and then boundary conditions along the lateral boundaries of the domain for every time during the simulation after that. And we ran 4 simulations that I'm showing you the differences between here. So the first 2 simulations had the same boundary conditions, but different initial conditions. And I'm showing you a transect across the domain and how the wind field differences between these 2 simulations evolve over time. And you can see that until about 100 seconds into the simulation, those differences are pretty pronounced, and then they slowly start to decay until about 200 seconds into the simulation, when the boundary conditions really take over and there's no more difference between the 2 simulations. And what happens when we perturb only the boundary conditions and have the initial conditions be the same is that this taking over of the boundary conditions actually happens much quicker. Before 100 seconds, there's strong differences all throughout the domain between the 2 wind fields. And this was a surprising result to us because we really expected initial conditions to drive this variability that we're seeing. Because once the fire really gets going, it generates a lot of its own wind fields. And we thought that just applying a slight nudging along the boundaries would not have an effect after that point. But as you can see in these results, it really does. So we ran 2 more ensembles, one initial condition ensemble shown here in red, and one boundary condition ensemble to see how the perturbation of initial versus boundary conditions really contributes to the overall variability that we're seeing in area burned for our core ensemble. And so here we're comparing this only for the first 20 simulations of the core ensemble, with 20 simulations for initial condition perturbations and 20 simulations for boundary conditions. And you can see that they both contribute about the same magnitude of spread between these 3 metrics that we're looking at. So one is not more important than the other. It really is a combination of the 2, which to me personally was a bit of a surprise, but also, you know, an exciting result. So now I want to pivot from this work to a different study where we looked at how the sensitivity affects the use of wind observations when we think about initializing and constraining fire simulations. And we're going to be looking at a couple results from a recent paper by Rodlin in modeling the RX Cadre 2012 fire experiment. And so this is the domain at Eglin Air Force Base where the fire experiment was performed. The individual dots that you see here that have these A numbers are all wind anemometers. So they are recording wind speeds. And this is the modeling domain that was used to simulate the fire. And here's our ignition line in orange. So the 5 blue anemometers is what I'm showing you data for here. They're all fairly close together, you know, less than 30 meters apart. But you can see already from just looking at these wind roses that there was some variability in what they recorded. A31, for example, showed a wide spread in wind directions, while A73 pretty much recorded wind coming predominantly from the north. And then there were also a couple that recorded the wind direction not being due north, but more north-northwest or north-northeast over here. And so just as in the previous study, we're looking at small perturbations in the mean wind, right? So we have a large scale wind field, and within that we have some turbulence, and that results in having these slight differences in the recorded wind speeds. So what happens when we just use each of these anemometer measurements to initialize a fire tech simulation of the fire spreading from this ignition line south? And now I want you to take your brain and try to flip that all upside down, because these figures here of the simulation outcomes are actually inverted. So north is now pointing down and slightly to the left, not even just straight down. And then in black here is highlighted an approximate fire perimeter of the actual fire that burned at Eglin in 2012. And then in blue for each of these simulation outcomes is the burn scar that FireTech produced being initialized with these winds from these individual anemometers. And so again, you can see really big differences that come from just using a wind sensor that recorded the wind a few meters over from another wind sensor. And the center
Alex,
here,
about 2 minutes.
Thank you. In the center here, you have the largest fire scar. This burns straight out of the computational domain. And here the wind has the strongest rightward component. I'm not going to try to invert the directions in my head here. But, or, you know, a long ignition line component, say, because the ignition line is tilted slightly in the same direction. The simulation with the strongest wind component perpendicular to the ignition line, on the other hand, kind of burned sideways and then quickly died out. So both of these studies looked at marginal burning. So they're both more applicable to prescribed fire than wildfire, but both of them highlight that there's strong sensitivity of marginal fire spreading in atmospheric conditions, specifically to small perturbations associated with turbulence. And so I want to bring this back to Kevin's previous comment during his talk. We really need to understand the uncertainty envelope, and we can really only do that by using ensemble simulations. So if we had decided to run only one of these 5 simulations, we would not have gotten a good picture, and we would have seen disagreement between the observations and our simulation, but we wouldn't necessarily have known why. Yeah, so if you get anything out of this talk, then ensemble simulations are the way to go, especially when you're using coupled fire atmosphere modeling and explicitly resolving atmospheric turbulence, which then in turn impacts fire behavior and fire spread. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Alex. Want to encourage everybody to go to the Whova Q&A and go ahead and record your questions there if you have any. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, Alex, was so in the sensitivity of that sort of homogeneous grass fire, a line of fire moving in a turbulent wind field, the sensitivity to sort of the timing, the start time, or the timing of the ignition relative to the gusts. How would that change with a more complex ignition pattern? Like if you had, a grid of point source ignitions or 2 or 3 head fires, does complexity or the addition of more fire lines stabilize that variance?
I really would not be able to say, but that is of course something that we can do. And now that we have an awesome grad student working on this problem, I'll make sure to suggest it to her.
I'm fascinated by how,
You're muted, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, we sort of think about how controllable fire is from prescribed fire. I mean, it is we make predictions and then we go out and conduct patterns. And I'm wondering if the actual addition of fire to the situation actually has a stabilizing impact on this highly variable response to sort of the natural perturbations.
Yeah, that is a really good question. Be important to look at for sure. You're muted again, Kevin.
Anybody else from the panel have any? Yeah, that's twice. You got to do that to me twice. Want to throw a question out to the group or to Alex?
I think a question / comment, and Alex, I think you have more knowledge on this than I could possibly talk about, is how the ignition is defined and how that influences things, right? We were seeing with the work Rod led that how the wind is moving across to that very straight ignition line might influence end result. And then Kevin brought up the really good point of, well, if it was spotted, or say, for example, if it had a little wiggle to it, how would that do something? Yeah. So I'm kind of curious, have you ever tried like putting a little zigzaggy wiggle or something along those lines in to see what happens?
So personally, I haven't played with different ignition lines other than just ignition line length. But I know other people have in fire tech done, maybe not wiggles, but discontinuous fire lines and different ignition lines that move towards each other, like Kevin mentioned.
That's great, Kara, though. I mean, I'm thinking about like that. I mean, maybe wiggles will be a kind of a first step towards the level of complexity I was initially thinking, but that's fascinating. Got time for one more question or comment, if anybody
There's a question from Bill Hoffman. Is this sort of variation more of an issue for marginal burn conditions?
Yeah, because the hypothesis is that once you have a more intense fire, it will generate a lot more heat and will generate a lot more of its own wind. And then it will be less susceptible to these small perturbations versus a low intensity fire can be more susceptible. Does that make sense, Ryan?
Thanks for that.
That's great. Ryan, if you are seeing those questions in Whova, I'm not. So maybe if you see them, just keep asking, bringing them back into the conversation. Well, Alex, thank you so much for that talk. It's fantastic illustration of sort of how variation and these tools work. And we can go ahead and open up screen share for Louise Loudermilk, who's going to be our next speaker. And Louise, while you're sharing, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. Dr. Louise Loudermilk is a close friend and colleague. She is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service at the Southern Research Station in Athens, Georgia. Louise and I've had the privilege of working with her. She's had the pain of working with me for almost 17 years. And
True
today
that.
today she's going to talk about using ecosystem process models to inform fire atmospheric models. So Louise, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is a really exciting session. I'm like on the edge of my seat, like watching these talks. So really cool stuff. Yeah, and just like any project, there's all kinds of people involved. So Forest Service, North Carolina State University, Tall Timbers, and the sort of linking between models. And I think there's definitely the ability to link this with the virtual reality stuff that Russ was talking about, and including some of the sensitivity analysis that Alex was doing. But so the idea here is that there's different types of models out right there. There's hundreds, maybe even thousands of different types of models. But when we're specifically looking at ecosystem process models, they provide this really intricate, they can provide really intricate information about biogeochemical cycling, growth and like soil properties and soil respiration. And that's often sort of linked to species competition and biotic and abiotic disturbances. And so it's this link between the physical environment and the biological function. They're often simulated across space and across time. And the idea is really to simulate the projections over time. And they're really quite useful because you can incorporate these what if scenarios, right? Whether it's, management or climate or different types of, diseases to the forest, land use, whatever it is. And then we can look at these complex dynamics that are really hard to, let's say, measure, or even to, to measure sort of through time, through long periods of time. And here we can see potentially unanticipated outcomes. But then kind of on the other end, well, let me back up a second and say within these ecosystem process models, when they incorporate fire, it's typically at a relatively coarse scale. But then you have other models like coupled fire atmosphere models that you've already seen today that are really complex in how they represent coupled fire atmosphere dynamics. And so there's actually feedbacks between fire behavior and the atmospheric dynamics. And so forest structure, in this sense, affects fire behavior through fuel characteristics, but also through drag and turbulence. And so how do we potentially bridge the gap between these two? So a really broad question would be, how do we determine what processes of fire behavior are potentially important at coarser scales? And then how can we utilize coarse scale inputs, outputs actually from the ecological models and into a fire behavior model that is potentially more useful for management, where management can actually use that model. And so the second question there is what we're going to focus on today. Now, the good thing is that the link between these models is really the vegetation or the fuel aspects. But the difficulty really lies in how vegetation is characterized between the models. And it's also a question of scale. So we have an example landscape. This is very much a pilot study, literally hot off the press, just done in the last month here. And it's the Blodgett Forest Research Station. And this is smack dab in the middle of the Sierra Nevadas. It's a mixed conifer forest. It's been established for quite some time now, and they do a lot of timber management and some different types of silvicultural treatments. They do habitat management, as well as extensive prescribed fire and fuels treatments. So the model that we're using for our landscape model is the Landis-2, and it is a spatially explicit model, and it breaks the whole landscape down into two-dimensional cells where there are species age cohorts, and they actually do seed dispersal between the cells. There could be harvesting with spatially explicit or thinning, and of course fire. And within each one of these cells, depending on the different extensions that are available for Landis-2, which is quite a bit, you can go to the Landis-2 website and check it out. There can be, above and below ground processes that are incorporated into, how they interact with above and below below ground processes associated with carbon and nitrogen cycling. And of course, there's climate change that's incorporated into this as well, if you would like it to be. So this model can basically be as simple or as complex as you would like it to be. And you can have all kinds of different interactions. You can have fire and insects and disease and land use all going at the same time, if you got the computational power. So, but the fire component is there's different fire extensions with Landis 2, but it does sort of take this coarse perspective on how fire is simulated. And our focus model is the quickfire model, which is basically a spin-off from the fire tech model that's been around for about 20 years. And so you can actually go into this, this paper explains the model really well, but it is a 3-dimensional coupled fire atmosphere model, and you'll see some simulations as we move forward here. Now, we're thinking about downscaling. So it's really, when you're thinking about going from fine scale to coarse scale, that's not really that difficult. It's actually pretty easy because you're just, incorporating aggregation techniques. But going from this coarse scale to the fine scale is more complex, and you're basically adding heterogeneity to an area that often has one value. And so if we want to use information from Landis that's at a coarse scale into quickfire, we're going to have to do this sort of downscaling approach. And so Landis, it has the resolution is defined by the user, but in this case, Landis was actually simulated at 100 meters, 180 meters by 180 meters, which is roughly about 8 acres or about 3 hectares. And when they did one of those cells, you have age cohorts of different tree species. But quickfires run in 3 dimensions. It's a much higher resolution. Typically, they run it at about a 2 meter by 2 meter by 2 meter resolution. And then the trees actually have explicit coordinates, and they have attributes, and then there's surface vegetation, and it runs in 3 dimensions. And so when we were building the surface fuels, we said, okay, well, we know we can get surface fuel information out of Landis. It's actually simulated throughout the area. And so we could take that information about the fine fuels and what we say, okay, well, now we would actually be simulating in this relatively blocky landscape. So we did a simple linear interpolation to get more heterogeneity associated with that we can use in quickfire. Now, the canopy vegetation was a little more tricky. And so typically when you build a Landis 2 landscape, you use FAI data to populate into Landis, and then Landis simulates, and then those tree species might change and interact sort of through time. But it actually translates the information from FAI data into Landis 2. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. But what we want to do here is we want to take the information that's already been simulated in Landis 2, let's say for 10 to 20 years, and actually get information back that we can use in quickfire. And so this was done. This is an approach developed by Charles Maxwell from the Spatial Informatics Group, and some work with Zach Cope as well from Tall Timbers. And basically the idea is that okay, so it takes these raster map codes and correlates the cohort data to geographic representation. And so we take those map codes and we link them to different species, and let's say builds a tree list with tree attributes, for each of those raster pixels based on the Landis 2 cohort data. And so again, because each one of these cells just sort of assumes that there's just age cohorts in it, we had decided to randomly place trees within the raster. And so now we have locations and tree attributes that are used to build this sort of 3-dimensional canopy. And so I just want to point out that this is a somewhat similar approach to FastFuels, and I'd love for Russ to maybe comment on this, or we'll hear about it later when he gives a talk about FastFuels. But so FastFuels takes more of like a machine learning approach when it links 30-meter patches to sort of similar FIA plots. But Charles's approach is somewhat similar, but it takes the veg cohort data output from Landit and links it explicitly to tree data within the FIA plot data. And so it actually goes through every cohort and links it to different cohorts that are in the FIA data. And so Charles's approach is meant to link models and FIA data for a variety of different types of models. That's kind of his thought process. But I think there's a really unique opportunity there to sort of link what FastFuels does and what Charles's approach does. Okay, so for additional inputs into Quickfire, we did you can get topographic information, of course, from the area. And we used a 10% surface fuel moisture content and a 4 meters per second, sort of moderate westerly wind. And this is kind of hot off the press, basic, we just did one fire line, but we wanted to see, okay, is there really a difference if we were to just take those raw, what we call blocky surface fuels from Landis 2, and we ran those in Quickfire, how would that differ from what's simulated in Quickfire if we did this sort of linear interpolation approach where the surface fuels are more heterogeneous? And, just from looking at this, just from a visual aspect, they don't seem all that much different to me, which I think is actually good news. So you can see a little bit of the blockiness kind of happening there with that one patch where there's, really low surface fuels. So to look at this a little bit more, we said, okay, well, what kind of area burned are we really talking about when these simulations end? And so the burned areas is a little bit different. With the blocky fuels, you're actually assuming that a little bit more areas has experienced fire. And so it's about a 10% different in this particular simulation. But I think if you took Alex's approach, where you did like an ensemble, and you can trial different types of scenarios of ignition lines and wind speeds and fuel moistures, and you can get a much more interesting comparison between these different types of simulations. And we did a few additional simulations where we included a backing fire. And then we also increased the wind speeds, and that definitely sort of made a difference. And this is just an example of different types of things that you can do within the Quickfire environment to look at some of those sensitivities. And here I just wanted to show, so this is not from Blodgett, this is from back closer to me, about an hour from me here in Georgia. And this is, I just wanted to show you what you can do with Quickfire. If you haven't really seen some of the outputs before, this is a very discrete run where this is a very explicit landscape where we got spatial information from ALS, from the tree locations and size. We got explicit ignition rates and locations and lines. We actually took this information in the field while it was being burned. And also there was hand ignitions, but also we had a UAS, dropping ping pongs. And we were able to incorporate a little bit more variation in fuel moisture across this landscape, especially associated with topography and surface fuel bulk density. So you can really see a difference and really interesting sort of fire line interactions with this.
Louise, about 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And I also wanted to show that from Quickfire, that you could get spatially explicit, total heat energy from it, and you can link these to fire effects. So this is some work that's going on in the area in Georgia that I was talking to you about. But we can begin to, and this is a really good way of linking the model back into Landis. So the next steps here are basically to not just use the outputs from Landis 2, but we can actually feed back that information back into from Quickfire back into Landis 2 and do some comparisons there, because there's also fire effects going on within Landis 2 if fires occur. And compare some of the, fire distributions or fire sizes or fire effects or mortality patterns, between the different models. There's no mortality from Quickfire, but what we want to do is actually compare that to the different existing fire extensions within Landis 2. And some broader questions we have are, what are the effects of long-term projections, which we can do with Landis 2, on explicit fire behavior in particular areas based on those projection outputs from Landis. And then can we use future quickfire simulations to examine new approaches to fire management, such as different ignition patterns? And, we can sort of look at those, edges of the burn windows. And I'm sure you guys could add to this list, but this is just a list of like fine scale processes that we typically see in a management decision space. And, we already talked about ignition patterns. What about suppression tactics? Or what about invasive species? How might that sort of influence if invasive species were incorporated into the model at a certain point? How is that going to affect fire behavior patterns? And then like edge effects, here's a picture of an edge where sometimes edge effects can impede or even accelerate fire. And do these make a difference on model outputs and resulting management implications? And could there be more nuanced yet important implications based on these fire scale processes? Okay, so just some conclusions here. These are all really complex modeling tools that are constantly under development, and they're evolving, and they benefit from this type of, from any type of constructive criticism. And so, and there's a lot of pressure for them to be used to influence management, whether it's climate adaptation strategies, and to get more recommendations, and there's a need for continuous model evolution. And implementing these fine scale processes within management decision space in the models could allow more confidence when simulating at coarser scales. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Louise. Really appreciate it. What a wonderful topic of an application. Do we have any questions? Again, I don't see any in the chat. If anybody wants to jump in as part of the panel and toss any questions to Louise, feel free to come on in. Got time for one or two. So Louise, one of the things that's fascinating to me about incorporating essentially management realism, prescribed fire versus wildfire, and some of the fire effects that might result into like a Landis is to think about climate adaptation strategies and how, some of those fire effects might aggregate over many fires and over longer periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
Is that ultimately the goal for you and Rob and some of the other?
I think so, absolutely. We've even thought about this in terms of maybe there's another fine scale potential climate adaptation application is thinking about like refugia. And you don't necessarily get that captured in Landis, right? But you might get some of those, like when you have a heterogeneous burn, you can sort of capture a little bit more of those like potential refugia spots. So I think there's a lot of potential. It can go in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of interest right now in the treatment investment, and then thinking about it not just from a short-term wildfire risk impact, but then the longer-term climate adaptation and fire regime impacts that could be created, at least maybe for desired adaptation outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to jump in? If not, we'll move to the next talk. Thanks again, Louise. Oh, Kara, are you going to jump in? Or are you going to be the next talk?
I'm going to jump in.
All right, go ahead.
Jump in. I was wondering, what are the big barriers for you right now, Louise, in pulling all of this data together, right? Like, so you kind of mentioned that like you've got Landis 2 data, you've got FIA data. What are the things that are really like stopping up the works?
It's a little bit of capacity, right? Like who's going to do the work? But it's also, there's, because you've got different people kind of doing different things that are really cool, right? But like bring that all together, I think is what's, I don't necessarily we're saying we're being slow, but I think that's definitely a hurdle, right? To sort of advancing. So I think all the pieces are there. We just need to put it into the puzzle, right? So. Thanks, Kara. Good luck.
Yeah. So, Kara, since you're on the screen, thanks again, Louise. We'll go ahead and as you start to share your screen, I'll give you a quick introduction. So our next speaker is Kara Yedinak. She is a materials research engineer at the U.S. Forest Service Forest Products Lab in Madison, Wisconsin. And Kara is one of the most creative thinkers in fire that I know. And I'm really excited, even though the title of this doesn't look super creative, Kara. I'm really excited to, I'm just kidding, hear what you've got to say about just above the ground.
Nice. Well, I will start with just this is a deviation from my typical titles, and I have a formula to the others. So I was trying out something new. We'll see if it hits.
So it was creative.
Hey, thanks. All right. Thanks all for your time. I want to acknowledge all of my colleagues from across the country who I've been chatting with about this particular topic. Rod Lynn, Kevin Hiers, Joe O'Brien, Chet Hoffman, Alex Jonko, and Scott Goodrick. All right. So when we think about fire, we like to have our happy triangle of weather, topography, and fuels. And the weather component of it usually involves some sort of prevailing conditions. It might include a canopy drag component with it, or speeding up below the canopy a little bit. We might include the solar radiation coming down to the ground, warming up specific components and not warming others, and an exchange of moisture. And we assume that the fire behavior is proportional to roughly that mean mid-flame wind. So we simplify all of this down to a proportionality with regards to the wind.
Hey, Kara, I'm still seeing your title slide. It hasn't forwarded for me. I don't know if anybody else is having that.
Same thing here, Kevin.
Same thing. Okay. Let's stop share and start again to see if we can sort that out. All right, I'm going to advance. Let me know what happens.
Okay. I am still seeing just that title slide. Nope, there it is. Pull through.
There you go.
Weather,
Okay.
topography, fuels.
Beautiful. All right, so there's the canopy you didn't see before. I'm just now noticing there's snakes or vines or something hanging from there, so we'll ignore those for now. Anyway, all right. So again, right, like we make this assumption that fire behavior is roughly proportional to the mean mid-flame winds. And fire behavior, of course, is this like large encompassing word, but for now we'll stick with it and we can toy with it a little bit later. So we then split that off into thinking about the plume as well. This is a really cool figure, wonderful paper by Neil LaRoe and Craig Clements that came out in 2017. They're using Doppler LiDAR here to look at the radial flow of things through a plume. And this is it's a really simple burn space that they're working with, not a lot of vegetation as obstructions. But it highlights something really interesting, that there's a lot of in-draft flow coming in and flow going out and movement here. But in this case, we're thinking about the fire as this isolated plume or column. See if we can. So I brought up entrainment, and that's really what I'm actually talking about today. So entrainment was first introduced by Sir Geoffrey Taylor during a wartime report. And in 1949, Taylor spoke about it at a scientific meeting, but the first actual publication about the concept of entrainment didn't come out until 1956. Morton, Taylor, and Turner were actually friendly competitive, and came together to write this first paper. So the reference is below, and I'm happy to pass this on to anyone who wants to read this first start as well. But entrainment is as follows. So we've got a ground surface. It's noted by that triangle with the dash above it. We warm a space. So the warmer part is the redder part. And in warming that space, we induce buoyant flow. When that happens, it creates a pressure difference. And of course, because nature abhors a vacuum, the ambient air starts pulling in to that lower pressure area to start to build equilibrium back again. And that inward flow is technically called entrainment. The process induces quite a bit of shear, as you can imagine, with all this vertical and horizontal flow. So now we have turbulence taking place along the edges of what we would call a plume. And that also expands the extent of the plume as well. So generally, the thought is, without going into massive math here, the stuff leaving is about equal to the stuff entering. And it's important to note before I move past this, the entrainment is happening all along the entire plume or column of hot air that's moving. It doesn't happen just at the surface. And the rate at which it comes in is thought to be tied directly to the vertical velocity at that particular height. So with a fire, you can imagine the same sort of thing with much larger temperatures or temperature differences. And then, of course, we like to add in our wind component that I brought up earlier. And in this case, we usually tend to represent that as almost what you can think of as a tipped top, if you want to, where the whole thing just kind of leans a little bit one direction or the other, associated with the mean flow. So I brought up topography, weather topography, and fuels. So the topography component is really considered to be this sort of mechanical driver of location of the fire, or channeling of the flow, if you will. And on top of that topography, we typically think of fuels as being these things that are available as sites for combustion to take place, almost painted on top of the topography in differing amounts. And the fuels are typically defined by their fuel moisture, their mortality, are they live or dead, the density of that fuel bed, and how flammable they are. All of these things reduce plants to a fuel, which I think is really fascinating. What if we also considered those plants to be temporally changing objects? So I'm really excited that I got to go talk to you about this right after Louise presented, because I feel like this fits really well with what she was talking about. Plant structure, both vertically and horizontally, might make a really big difference, both in terms of space and time, with how flow moves past a plant or interacts with a plant. Plant pairing might make a pretty big difference as well. The plant surface temperature, whether it is influenced by insulation or influenced by actual combustion, might make a big difference, and also is temporally related. So all of these temporal attributes would influence the flow field of that fire environment. So it would influence flow in and around the plant groups. It might modify the flow by plants as they burn, plants that do not burn fully or in part. It would influence insulation, right? As we start to lose overstory or surface for that matter, how is that changing the overall temperature of things? And the flow might be modified by plants' response itself to fire. We've talked a little bit before in a past conference about rupturing fluids coming out of needles, and there's been a couple recent publications on that. So moving from theory to more nuanced application. Here we have a little shrub with a typical wind field moving past it. This is what we currently think happens when we have an area on fire near that shrub. We have the exact same model for what happens when we have an area on fire in the canopy. So we're not accounting for how, I'm going to go back and forth again, how that entrained air gets to either of those spaces in slightly different scales and in slightly different levels of obstruction. So let's observe this from above. currently, what we're thinking is that we have an ignition line. I've got a little red dotted line there that's happening somewhere inside of a fuel bed. And here we've got, these little amorphous blobs denoting different vegetation. And the fire moves forward in a cute bow-type fashion associated with the mean flow. And that flow wraps around nicely at the flanks and produces vortices at the front. And all of this structure is quite predictable. But what about the plants? There they are in the background, but they didn't participate in the flow at all. What if it looked more like this? Now, this could be driven both by how the plants are channeling the ambient flow and how the fire itself is pulling in that entrained ear right next to the fire. Maybe the fire should actually look more like this. And maybe that shape is induced by the plants that are modifying the flow field around it. Now, I didn't speculate how that flaming front might look different, but you can imagine, just as was mentioned a couple times before, if we have multiple fires in this space, maybe a couple plants still burning in the back, how is that further going to augment flow? Because each of those locations is going to experience its own entrainment. So here's a couple cool pictures that I had the awesome opportunity to be able to take that really highlight how complex the fire environment is, right? Like here's this really, I wouldn't call this a fuel bed. This is a really interesting, complex space where each plant might make a significant difference for how that fire moves. So to expand this more generically, I'm going to fully acknowledge scale matters, right? Scale matters depending on the size of the fire and the size of the vegetation that we're talking about. The number of ignitions matters, likely, and the plant type and the plant's response to the fire environment also likely matters. And I want us to rethink how we think about this tipped top approach to these hot gases or this column moving forward. If I take half the branches away, shouldn't I have a different model? And what does that look like? I think we need to reimagine that. Likewise, if I light that plant on fire, what is the column going to look like? And I think we should reimagine that as well. And really pay close attention to the influence that we're having on the entrainment. So looking ahead, we need to assess scales of influence when we're considering these potentially plant-modified entrainment flows. Develop some theoretical descriptions for the time-varying change to the burn plants, and identify plant-induced changes to the flow. And this is beyond just them acting as an obstruction or acting as a source of flammable material. And finally, I think we need to pull together the developing research that's on this topic already. And on that note, I'm going to end on this slide, but I want us to spend a little time looking through these. There's a lot of really cool work going on right now that's starting to zero in on the flow around specifically fire lines and fire environment. That's starting to give us little pieces of the puzzle. There's still a lot left to be done.
Kara, about 2 minutes.
And I just finished, so thank you.
Awesome. We got plenty of time for questions. I don't see any in the Whova chat or Q&A, but feel free to drop them in there, or if you've got the ability to unmute yourself, toss a question directly to Kara.
Okay, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Is this, Rod and Scott have talked a lot about this sort of subgrid processes that occur, that they're sort of interested in getting into that a little bit more. Does this, does this sort of play into that same concept, or is it something a little different?
I think it depends on scale. Good question.
Yeah, right.
So like at some scales, it definitely would be subgrid scale, especially when we're talking about prescribed fire. When we get a bit larger, then we might be able to capture it where we're at now with the resolution we have. But I mean, I'm willing to hear other opinions on that. Yeah,
Great.
I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, we've talked before, and I think Gil Borer was the first that I ever heard mention this, but I've been thinking about it ever since. The fact that in a surface fire regime, smoke energy have to go through a canopy, and that canopy is moving back and forth, and trees are an obstruction in the way that you're talking about above an evolving fire. Does that fall within this sort of conceptual addition that you're talking about here, or is that something different?
That's a good question. I think again, this is like a scale challenge, right? So like I mentioned at the beginning that those flows are going to be those radial flows coming into this plume or these plumes, this space, right? Like, and that's a really significant oversimplification that I want to acknowledge as well. They're going to be driven, the magnitude of that is going to be driven by the vertical velocity, right? So I think that we have, like, it's kind of this trade-off of the more stuff that's burning, the higher the vertical velocity potentially. But one of the things that I think is also really interesting, and I tried to not poke at it too many different times so far, is smoldering, right? Like I think we should have like a whole nother session on smoldering combustion. There's a ton of stuff we need to cover here. But a smoldering space left behind is still producing those vertical flows. And that the depth of that and the energy behind that is really fascinating. In the fire atmosphere conversations, fire weather work, a lot of pyrocumulonimbus folks are starting to recognize that the extent of the smoldering area is pretty important to the launching of those pyrocumulus.
I think you're right, and we've seen that as just a practical challenge to suppression in the West, but being able to model that and as a physical process at scale, I think it's really kind of the next frontier for these couple fire atmospheric behavior modeling tools is really to go from as Ruddy was talking about, get the physics close or whatever, and start getting it, tested out at the lower fidelity, higher scale, larger scale modeling tools. I've got one question that appears in the chat now, or the Q&A. It's from Seth Bigelow. It says, Kara, might vegetation structure affect the partitioning of smoke between the column and the ground, as an early speaker was describing? I think that was Scott Goodrick's.
Okay, let me, wait, will you read it again? Because I can't see that one.
So might vegetation structure affect the partitioning of smoke between the column, what is entrained in the column, and the ground, as what was discussed earlier by Scott Goodrick?
Yeah. So essentially, is the canopy interacting with that smoke column and acting like a scrubber? Absolutely, right? Like that's a pretty interesting, significant mechanical response. And I think getting back to your comment too of like the flapping and movement of that canopy and the height of that canopy and amount present might have a pretty big impact as well. It can also act as a cap, which is we have seen before also.
Right. So we've got time for one more. If anybody has a question, Russ, since you're up next, if you want to go ahead and begin the process of sharing your screen, we'll start on time, but leave the floor open for another 30 seconds if anybody wants to ask another question. Great. Well, Kara, thank you so much. I really appreciate that talk and really look forward to unpacking some of those ideas further. I hope that you'll also be available tomorrow at the Fire Circle, because I think that these kinds of conversations are really important for understanding both how coupled fire atmospheric processes and the modeling works, but then, conceptually, how do we expand them into that application space? So up next, it's Russ. You're the bad penny talk, man. You're back. You turned up again, but you're also on mute. Can you hear me, Russ?
Yeah. Sorry. Can you see me now?
Yep, I got you.
Okay,
I got you, and
great.
I got you loud and clear.
Yeah, I am your bad penny. I'll tell you. Here I am. Thanks. Gosh, what a great session this is. I'm so excited about all these talks. So exciting this work. Okay, before I get going here, I just want to express my appreciation for all my partners who have been part of this process. I'm so thankful to work with them all. Our team spans multiple Forest Service research stations, as well as numerous universities and other partners. And we couldn't do this without everybody's being part of the team. So I think this big picture is a fairly common thing, but essentially these days our fire managers are facing a constantly changing landscape with increasing risk, complexity, and uncertainty. We now realize that suppression alone will not fix our problems. We need more proactive approaches in fuels management, such as fuel treatments and prescribed fire. And if we're going to get solutions to our fire problems that we have now and as they are in the future, we're going to need the best data, models, and tools sooner than later. Fire models play a key role in understanding risks and in decision support. At present, however, current fire models are primarily oriented towards suppression and do not represent fuels with much detail. For example, this Great Basin fuel bed is highly variable and discontinuous, but is represented as continuous and homogeneous in our common fire behavior fuel models. This abstraction makes it difficult to describe real fuels data or to track fuels changes from fuel treatments or disturbances. Going forward, we need fuel models that capture structure, composition, heterogeneity, and composition and condition, sorry. So my career has been centered around what I consider the fuels to models problem. We basically have many ways to describe fuels well from field and lab data. Forest models such as FVS track individual tree attributes and stand dynamics over time. But at present, the bulk of this detail can't even be used by common fire models. Instead, they operate on overall stand summaries such as single values for stand height. This bottleneck tends to reduce sensitivity to fuel changes, often limiting the depth of analysis possible in evaluating fuel treatments or other factors which alter fuels at fine scales, like disturbance. Now, this topic has been this topic of this session, so I'm not going to get into great detail, but I think it's important to note that the underlying math behind these physics-based fire models dates back to 1822, which we're coming up on 200 years. And of course, it's modern computing that has brought this math to light and put it into tools that we are now able to start using in the context of the talks that have been presented today. But I think that's remarkable. Anyhow, one of the areas in which detailed interactions between fuel and fire that these more advanced models can handle is in fuel treatments. So our team came up with StandFire, which is a platform for looking at fuel treatment effectiveness that leverages FVS data, tree list data, and connects to multiple 3D physics-based fire models. So as part of our development of StandFire, we've developed a series of metrics that look at, that summarize the output from simulation data. We can, get under the hood and look at what happened in a given simulation. And importantly, we can also take the individual trees and crank them through tree mortality models. And so this is looking at an untreated case, and this is with a treated case. So you can see that that's really useful for looking at things like resilience when we want to know that the remaining stand after we do a fuel treatment is going to survive the next fire. In addition to the development of these new models, we of course have increasing availability of truly remarkable data like what we have from airborne LiDAR scanning. People are familiar with it now, but it is a remarkable thing in that it gives you tree locations, height, and canopy dimensions, often over very large areas. So this is, of course, a very active arena of research. Similarly, we have other new data sources that are becoming more and more accessible from TLS and UAS. There's been a number of talks at this conference about these topics, but they basically give us a higher level of detail for local areas that can be carried out often at low cost for on a plot basis. So what we have basically been dealing with is that we have this need for advanced data to get into these advanced models. Our FastFuels project is really intended to close that gap. It's intended to accelerate the use of advanced fire models and fuel mapping approaches and provide defensible wall-to-wall 3D fuels data. So we're kind of envisioning FastFuels as a superhighway connecting fuels data to fire models. One of the key goals for FastFuels, One of the key goals for FastFuels is to reduce bottlenecks from data availability. Since detailed data sets like ALS are not universally available, FastFuels seeks to fill the gaps. Leveraging tree list data from Karen Riley's tree map layer, which links FIA tree list data to landscape locations, and the underlying structure of Standfire, FastFuels develops synthetic 3D fuels data seamlessly over large areas. Leveraging our Standfire structure, tree list data are transformed to voxel arrays for input to advanced fire models. This animation shows a tile of 3D fuels as voxel arrays over an area of a couple square kilometers. Tree crowns are represented with collections of voxels. Different colors represent different tree species. The FastFuels process can be automated, so data can be developed for specific areas on demand or cranked out for large areas with use of a big server. With support from our partners in the NSF-funded Wildfire Commons project, a first cut of FastFuels data is currently in development for a good portion of the US. Querying the map provides an interactive 3D fuels viewer. Voxels are can be output at different resolutions, and we plan to make it possible for multiple fire models. And of course, the data themselves are derived from the underlying tree list data. The underlying tree list data in FastFuels is critical to fuel treatment analysis, enabling simulation of silviculturally detailed fuel treatments, such as thinning from below to a specific basal area target. This tree level data also enable us to characterize fuel changes from disturbance processes such as beetle attacks, as shown here. This fuel detail, as well as connection to the advanced fire models, greatly strengthens our capacity to evaluate fuel treatments. Many factors affect fuel condition. Remote sensing and modeling offer ways to capture landscape gradients and dynamics over time, and to reflect how those changes may affect fuel's attributes. FastFuels architecture will facilitate assimilation of spatial data or raster time series, enabling dynamic fuel maps in space and time. This is maybe an example of where some of the modeling that Louise was talking about could fit in. FastFuels' primary purpose is to accelerate the use of advanced fire models by closing gaps in data availability and simplifying the process of input file creation. Here you can see FastFuels, fuels data, and complex terrain data used as input to the quickfire model. The upper left quadrant shows fuel consumed. The next one below it is moisture loss. The lower right is vertical energy transferred to the atmosphere, and the upper right is surface winds and 3D smoke. Most of my research career, I've been interested in these more detailed models, but most of that time they've also been limited by the fact that there's very little data that goes into them in a straightforward manner. So really our goal with FastFuels is to close that gap and make it possible to get data into these models without such a hassle. Of course, by the underlying architecture of FastFuels is leveraging FIA tree list data, which are not spatially explicit to every point on the ground. So we need a way to incorporate better data for when it's available. We're calling this on-ramps. The basic idea being that if you have better local data, it can be assimilated into FastFuels, providing better data for your immediate needs. FastFuels is a prototype system and still under active development. It is intended to complement, not replace, current systems. We hope that FastFuels will accelerate research in and use of advanced fire models and new fuel mapping data to support fuel treatments and prescribed fire. Going forward, we hope to collaborate broadly with the research and management communities, including working with managers in demo sites with specific fuel treatment projects. All right, I think that's it for me, if people have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Russ. I would like to ask you maybe to describe some of the on-ramps you envision for surface fuel heterogeneity to complement some of the canopy heterogeneity that's already imputed into those cells. Right,
sure. Well, there's a number of different on-ramps that we're considering. We're currently prototyping one with ALS data, and that makes a lot of sense because there's increasingly a lot of ALS data available. We're also working on starting to develop some on-ramps that would assimilate high resolution imagery, such as from UAS or from data from like Planet, things like that. Ultimately, our strategy for representing surface fuels is similar to how we're dealing with trees, in that it's a list-based type thing in which objects representing individual trees, shrubs, or patches of grass are modeled. So we're also talking about developing a prototype method in which people could develop a running list from field methods using tablets, where they could look at their local area and basically sum up the kind of things they're seeing and summarize those, and it would make a format by which that could come into this modeling system as well. But ultimately, there's so many ways we can do this, and it really is the start of a new era in which all of these detailed data sets have a place to go with these advanced fire models. And there's going to be so many different ways we can represent them. And I think that it's a great opportunity to really leverage the creativity and analytical skills of our whole research community as we get into this fuel mapping problem where we're looking at fuels at a higher level of detail. So I'm super excited about that. Our goal with FastFuels is to make it easy for people to get their approach, their data into the system. So we want to really have an open source development platform going forward in which people can contribute to the growing body of this effort.
Awesome. There is a comment in the Q&A. It's from Justin Ziegler. Russ, not a question, but an observation. Locally measured fuels to update predictions creates a network effect whereby forest measurements done by your neighbor improves precision on your land. I don't know what the power of this leverage is, but surely better than a one-way algorithm that updates as slowly as FIA cycles. Maybe really kind of gets to the question of, do we need to be rethinking the way that we collect monitoring data and aggregating that, taking advantage of maybe some of those TLS-based approaches?
Yeah, I would agree. Justin, I totally agree that what we have is an opportunity to leverage all these different data sources, both from imagery, FIA tree lists, other plot data that people collect, local UAS data collections and fieldwork. If we play our cards right, all of those things can feed into more continuous monitoring and updating of our fuels mapping, which will have tremendous synergistic effects on our ability to model fire, explore different management scenario outcomes and possibilities, and generally just give us a much more robust platform for deciding what we want to do to change our landscape conditions.
Russ, you know, I'm a huge fan. I think this is a game changer. It's sort of the enabling conditions for really unlocking the power of these couple fire atmospheric modeling approaches, a variety of tools. And one of the things that I love is that you know, in this, I think it's the spirit in which we've all organized a special session is that the future is going to have a variety of tools, and we want to enable and use and leverage all of them together. You know, as a suite of models moving forward, whether they're in ensembles or operating at vastly different scales. You know, the future is really trying to get a handle on the capacity and the opportunity space and the accessibility of these things. And FastFuels is really the game changer that I think opens up those doors.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I really hope that's the case. I think that it's, for me, it's been a really cool experience to work through this, and I'm really excited about where we're going with it. And again, it's really, we have a lot of partners working with us on this, and I think that it opens a door that leads to more effective collaborations across a wide group of people. So just having, it's kind of like the field of dreams idea, right? If you build it, they will come. What we've done with FastFuels is built a relatively simple framework in which all of the detailed data that people are currently collecting with TLS, ALS, UAS, and other things have a place to go. So if you can think of it like FastFuels data at present is maybe like a draft paper, but now people have an opportunity with these on-ramps to edit that paper and make it better. And I think that if we're able to establish this kind of collaboration well, which I think we're on a good path to do, it'll only accelerate the use and ability of these new data sets and technologies and models to all contribute to a better understanding of what fuels do. And I think like some of the things that have been talked about in this session, like Kara's talk, for example, being able to capture those kind of fine scale interactions and include the representation of those things in how we model fuels and fire is incredibly important. So,
or know when they matter, right? I mean, and that's
right.
The beautiful
Assess,
thing. Yeah. So before we close out, and I do want to leave time for anybody else to add another question for Russ or any of the panelists in this afternoon's portion of the special session. And again, just jump on in if you have the ability to unmute your mic. I do want to let everybody know we are planning a fire circle in conjunction with Alex Dye's special session on fire modeling and climate change models. We're going to be doing that tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Really hoping that all the speakers, if you're available, are going to be there to have a real robust conversation. And I know that the virtual, I'm not going to dog on the virtual meeting platform because it's been a privilege to be with y'all today, but it doesn't lend that itself to that kind of natural flow of conversations. But tomorrow, hopefully, these fire circles will allow you more of an interactive opportunity to talk about, you know, the tools, their limitations, and then their application space. And that's what I really look forward to is thinking even more creatively than many of us are about how we can leverage these you know, this suite of tools. It's so powerful and this becoming so much more accessible. Unless there's anything else, I want to thank the speakers and I want to thank all the participants for today. This has been just an amazing session to listen to. I'm privileged to be part of it with y'all. Is there any parting comments before I turn it back over to Ryan? Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. Ryan, do you have any closing remarks for us?
Thanks, Kevin. Got a few. I just want to thank all our speakers for sharing your expertise today. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, will be our afternoon plenary featuring keynote speaker, our very own Kevin Hiers, wildlife fire scientist of Tall Timbers Research Station, Allie Archibald of University of Witwatersrand, professor at the School of Animal, Plant, and Environmental Sciences. We will also announce the winners of the AFE Lifetime Achievement Awards. To access this session, use the agenda tab on the left of your screen, click Sessions, and then click the main session title to join. Thanks again to our speakers and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks all, take care.